Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. I see we still have people joining us. Hi, everyone. I can see we still have people joining quite rapidly, so we'll just give it a few more seconds before we begin. Thank you for joining us. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know we still have quite a few people joining. It's great to see that participants number tick up so rapidly, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and get our event today started. Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion of recent trends in global arms transfers and military expenditures. I'm Rachel Stoll, Vice President at the Stimson Center and Director of the Conventional Defense Program. I'm really excited to be joined today by experts from SIPRI and the Security Assistance Monitor, who will be highlighting their recent research that will inform our discussion on how the tumultuous events of the last year have really impacted global weapons flows and military spending. This is the 6th year that Stimson and SIPRI have co-hosted an event reflecting on these recent trends in arms transfers and military expenditures. And while we were hoping we'd get to finally return to hosting this event in person, we are really excited that we can continue to have this discussion virtually and are really pleased that so many people from around the world are able to join us. For those that don't know, SIPRI is among the foremost authorities on global arms transfers and military expenditures. I know those of us in the field rely on their data and research regularly. Among SIPRI's most significant contributions are the databases that track decades worth of arms transfers and military spending by countries around the world. And each year, SIPRI releases reports that highlight these recent trends and notable arms transfers, which allow us to better understand the shifting and oftentimes opaque dynamics of the global arms trade and worldwide military spending. SIPRI's latest trends report examining global weapons flows and military expenditures in 2020 were just published a few weeks ago. And so we're really happy to be able to discuss those with all of you. I have the honor of introducing two SIPRI scholars, Nan Tian and Peter Mezaman, who are both senior researchers with SIPRI's Arms and Military Expenditures Program. They're going to discuss these latest reports, walk through some of the trends that they're seeing in the data, and have a conversation with us. I'm also really delighted to be joined by Lauren Woods, who's the director of the Security Assistance Monitor at the Center for International Policy. Again, for those of us in the field, Security Assistance Monitor is an invaluable resource for those of us that are tracking global arms trade. The databases and analyses of U.S. arms transfers and security assistance really make enormous contributions of our understanding of the U.S. and its role as the world's largest arms exporter. And we'll hear more from Lauren about their recent report, U.S. Arms Sales Trends 2020 and Beyond, from Trump to Biden, in just a moment. Before I turn things over to our panelists, I want to set the scene a bit. I really always look forward to hosting this annual discussion of recent trends in arms transfers and military spending, but I'm especially eager for today's conversation, given the remarkable events of the last year and their continued impacts on militaries around the world. When we gathered last year, it was just at the beginning of the global pandemic. And we've really seen in this last year the pandemic disrupt national economies and global supply chains, which in turn has complicated government efforts to buy and sell weapons and invest in their military capabilities. The ongoing health crisis also highlighted the extent to which some of the greatest threats to international security are ones that don't have military solutions, which creates increased pressure on countries to deprioritize military expenditures and arms transfers. Meanwhile, we've had increased attention to the role arms sales play in fueling humanitarian crises, particularly in Yemen, just this last week in the Middle East, in Israel and Gaza. And there have been growing calls for governments to suspend arms transfers that are likely to contribute to civilian harm. In the United States, Congress has shown a renewed interest in challenging arms sales to governments where the weapons could be used to perpetuate conflict and contribute to civilian harm. Newly installed President Biden and his administration has indicated that it might take a more restrained approach to arms sales than its predecessors. The jury's still out on that. Let's see what happens. And it will remain to be seen if their policies really match their rhetoric. So you put all of these circumstances together, and we've seen significant disruptions to global arms transfers and military spending, though not always in ways that we might have expected. So, for example, while SIPRI found that the value of global arms transfers was exceptionally low in 2020, they also found that some countries continue to expand their arms exports from last year. For its part, the United States experienced an unprecedented surge in foreign military sales in 2020, according to the Security Assistance Monitor. And while most national economies suffered as a result of the global pandemic, SIPRI found that overall military expenditure not only continued to rise in 2020, but managed to reach the highest level in decades. It's also really worth noting there's still a lot we don't know about how the events of this past year have impacted the global arms trade and worldwide military spending. It's unclear, for example, how much of the reduction in global arms exports in 2020 was attributable to the global COVID-19 pandemic, as opposed to other unrelated shifts in supply and demand that we see regularly. It also remains to be seen how serious the US Congress and President Biden and their foreign counterparts are about constraining arms transfers likely to contribute to civilian harm, and delays and gaps in information provided by governments further limit our understanding of recent trends and underlying causes. These complexities, these unanswered questions, all of these caveats underscore the vital role that organizations like SIPRI and the Security Assistance Monitor play in promoting transparency and enabling sound data-driven analyses. And so I'm really excited today to hear more about what we can learn from their research, what we can predict about the future, and how much we really still don't know. We are going to hear from each of our panelists. They will give short presentations. I will then follow up with a few questions for each of them. And once all three are completed, we will open to questions from the audience. You will see that you can use your Q&A function to see or to address the panelists with specific questions. You'll be able to see questions others have asked. So you may want to build off a question or reinforce a question that someone else has asked. I will now turn it over to Nantian to tell us a little bit about military spending.
Hi, thank you, Rachel. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone from around the world. Yes, I will set the scene by providing a brief overview of the recent report, SIPRI's recent report on global military spending trends. So I will start by sharing my screen so that you can see some slides. To set the scene, what you see is that global military spending in 2020 was $1.98 trillion. This is the closest to 2 trillion that we have ever recorded since SIPRI has looked to provide a consistent estimate of global military spending. And 2020 was the 6th consecutive year where spending increased globally. And this increase of what we saw was 2.6% was the highest, second highest increase over the past decade. If we look further back, we can see that since about 2017, our headline for our report could easily have been the highest level ever because you can see that it's been the highest level every single year for the past 3 years. And it seems to be that this trend technically is continuing to increase. But looking further back to the late 1990s, to get a better long-term understanding, we see that it's clear that world military spending has experienced this long-term increase, broken down by a short period in the early 2000s where spending decreased. But the overall trend for the last 2 decades has very much been continued increases in world spending. And of course, with this graph, what's really interesting, another interesting point, is that you can see the distribution between the different regions and the countries that really drive the global trend. In the Americas, remaining the largest share, of course, is basically the US being the largest spender in the world. But then we see that the rise of essentially China and India, where we see the share of spending by Asia and Oceania increase and overtake that of Europe. And very much this shift in the share of spending, where it used to be US and Europe, where now it's very much US, Asia, and Oceania, specifically India and China. Maybe going more specifically back to the 2020 data, one of the main contributors to this higher increase in 2020 was that 9 out of the 10 largest spenders in the world all increased its spending, with the exception of Saudi Arabia. The US, the largest spend you can see by far at 778 billion, increases spending by 4.4%. China, the second largest spender, increased by 1.9%. India increased, Russia increased, Germany increased. I mean, all the major spenders really increased. And it really is telling that these top 10 spenders, which account for, you can see here in the graphic, 75% of the global spending, that if these countries increase, it's almost irrelevant from a numerical perspective, what the other 140 plus countries really do. The global trend is very much going to be that the spending is going to increase. And of course, apart from these top 10 spenders, the next graphic, we can see that if we divide these numbers by subregions around the world, the overall trend is very much the same picture, that it's been increasing. Military spending has been increasing in almost every subregion. And this is a combination of either the largest spenders in these subregions increasing the spending, or most of the countries or numerous countries in these subregions all increased spending, which contributed to very much, you can see that's North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, North America, Oceania, all of these increases. And of course, this essentially occurred at a backdrop where global GDP, or GDP in almost every single country, had decreased in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the only notable country where the GDP didn't decrease was in the case of China. And of course, the immediate consequence of what we found in our report was that the sudden shift in that the military spending as a share of GDP, what we call as military burden, essentially rose in almost every single country, well, in majority of countries around the world. As you can see from this graphic, that basically all the countries in red shows that as a percentage points, military burden, military spending as share of GDP essentially increased with only a few exceptions. And so where we have 150 countries in our database, the military burden really increased almost throughout, which is the point where I think global military burden is at 2.4% of global GDP, the highest level since the 2009 financial crisis. And many other countries have reached very much high points in the military burden, not seen for decades. And so this is the immediate consequence that we have seen from higher military spending and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, it opens up the questions that we have looked into and discussed is about, well, the affordability or the sustainability of these continued increases in military spending. So I think I'll leave it at that for now in terms of the trends. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. It's really fascinating to me because I said it at the beginning and you've repeated it several times, but it's very surprising that military spending increased despite the global pandemic. How certain, accurate is that 2020 data? Do you think that really is the case? So when we go back and sort of adjust in the years coming, is that really going to be what we see?
Yes, I think from a general standpoint, many have questioned this idea that given that we have such a health crisis and the related economic recession, how can it be that military spending continue to increase? But I think from our perspective, it's important to understand that spending on the military has a very strong inertia. That for many of these largest military spenders, USA, China, Russia, India, they've implemented these costly modernization and expansion programs that last well into the 2020s, 2030s, sometimes 2040s. And so these plans are already in place, and essentially the budgets of these plans has been planned and passed well before the worst case of the pandemic. And so at least in 2020, the spending levels are almost set. And what we've seen from historical analysis, partly from the 2009 global financial and economic crisis, was that there's a lag effect between the economic recession and the impact it has on military spending. That the recession in 2009, military spending only really started to decrease in 2011, 2012. And so we might expect a lag. And based on the certainty of our data, we definitely have more accurate data for the larger spenders, the more recent data for these larger spenders. And it seems to be that we are quite certain that indeed 2020 is going to be an increase.
Yeah, you had very few countries sort of on the negative side of your chart. So I'm wondering if you can say anything about the types of impact that you have seen the COVID-19 pandemic have on military spending. We know that, as you said, there's this inertia, but there have been some impacts, and we've seen big headlines to that effect.
So yes, I mean, we had initially three general observations that we can summarize in terms of the initial assessments. And one of them is that there are indeed numerous countries that actually are known to have reduced or diverted military spending for other uses, essentially fighting the pandemic. Chile is one example. South Korea has openly stated that they would decrease their spending, divert money from the military to COVID-19 relief efforts. So that's one clear case. So there are exceptions. But then on the other hand, there are also another exception where, in the case of Hungary, they've actually essentially made a policy that military spending will be part of a stimulus package in response to the pandemic. So providing more resources, spending more on the military is a way of kind of spending out, boosting the economy out of the pandemic. So these two arguments very much are at heads, where on one hand, it's very much following the idea that, okay, decrease money on military spending to support social spending, and on the other hand, it's very much about maybe defense lobbies, the defense ministries, so the defense establishments, suggesting that they need to continue spending on the military. And of course, the third point very much being that indeed military burden is now the highest it's been since 2009. And of course, this would very much brings out the question of, well, affordability and sustainability and the cost of the military.
Can you just expand on that idea of military burden a little bit, and sort of explain to our viewers what you mean and what we should be looking for there?
I mean, I think a good to know example is, many of us know about the NATO burden sharing argument. And so with the economy, essentially almost every single country's economy in a recession, this target of 2% very much is fallen back, and now it's within reach. We saw in our analysis that every single country in NATO country except for Bulgaria increases military burden. And now we have about 12 NATO countries we see that has now reached this 2% mark. But again, this very much brings me to this idea of international stability or military security versus human security. And Rachel, you mentioned that, often some of the greatest threats or the health crisis is it's not something that can be solved through the military with military solutions. And again, this is often lost in some of our work, that the question about the priorities the government should provide in times of health crisis. Should resources, these limited resources, be brought about to spend on military or other social, really human security needs? And again, part of our work we do is to kind of provide this information to open the debate about these questions.
Thanks so much for that, Nan. I want to turn to Peter, because we're talking that military spending is increasing. So what are people spending it on? Are they buying more arms sales? And so I want to turn to you, or buying more arms, I should say. I want to turn to you to sort of give us a picture of what arms transfers look like in the last year.
Yes, thanks, Rachel, both for the question and of course for having me here and having Cypri here. First of all, yes, military spending, one part of that is arms procurement, and one part of that is arms procurement through arms imports. And that raises then all kinds of questions about what the responsibilities are of the arms suppliers in that particular framework, and how these things develop, what the role is of different suppliers. Are there new suppliers? Is the number of suppliers increasing? Is the role of the established suppliers still the same as it was in the past? And so to kind of shed a bit of light of that, I'll present a few slides too, and I'm trying to put those on the screen right now. Let's see. And here you should see them. I hope you see them now. And so,
not yet.
Not yet. And we have a slide. There we go. And now you will see them here. And so what we're looking here is the global trends and international transfers of major arms over a period of 40 years. And when I present this, of course, I have to explain that very different from what Nan just has presented. This is not in financial values. This is not in your normal standard US dollar values. This is based on the specific CIPRI way of creating statistical data about international arms transfers. Statistical data that is translated in what we call a trend indicator value that is intended to represent the transfers of military resources rather than the financial value of the arms transfers, rather than the prices, you could say, agreed between the supplier and the recipient. And we use production costs and then compare weapon systems and give every similar weapon system a similar value. And on the basis of that, and we then look at actual deliveries of major arms, and we come to an estimation of how these trends in international arms transfers look over time and between states. And as you can also see here, we prefer to do that in 5-year periods, as the volume of arms transfers may really significantly fluctuate year on year, as you can actually also see in this particular table, where we also present in a single line the figures per year. And you can really see how it can go up in real major peaks and falls over the years. But we do it in 5-year periods, preferably to provide a more stable measure of trends. And it's quite clear what has happened over the past 40 years. We see a very steep decline after the end of the Cold War, reaching a low point around 2000, 2005, then an increase again. And then if we compare the past 5-year periods, we see that arms transfers, international arms transfers, have stabilized at roughly the same level, even though the year-on-year values, as you can see, have fluctuated very significantly. Now, if we then look who are the main suppliers of arms in this scenario, then we see, not surprisingly, that it is the United States that accounts for by far the largest share of arms exports in the world. 37% is what we assess is what the US accounts for in terms of exports of major arms. And not only that, the US is also the country which has the largest number of countries that have received major arms, as depicted in this particular visualization. You can see that, yes, Saudi Arabia in the past 5 years has been by far the largest single recipient, but as you can also see, there are many, many other countries that have played a role as a recipient of major arms from the US. We have counted 96 in the past 5 years. And as you can also see, except for the case of Saudi Arabia, the spread is very broad. There's one major recipient, but for the rest, the other ones are the actual transfers are spread over many countries and in many regions too. This is quite different for other parts of the world, of other suppliers. If we look, for example, at Russia, which has been the second largest arms supplier since the end of the Cold War, It is now represented by approximately 20% of total arms exports. That's a country which has significantly fewer recipients of major arms. We counted roughly 45. And not only that, there are a few countries which have made up the bulk of the arms exports of Russia. In particular, we can see that India has already since long played a role as by far the largest recipient of Russian arms. But that is actually changing, but more about that bit later. But we can also see here that if we just look at those top five, the United States, Russia, France, Germany, and China, they account for 76% of total arms exports in the world. So world arms export are still very much dominated by a very small group of countries, primarily the US, a number of countries in Europe, and then topped up by a few outside in Asia and the Middle East, China, Israel, and South Korea. Now, if we then have a look at how this has changed over time, then we see also some very significant developments there. The United States has increased its market share, you could say. It has increased its total arms exports over the past 5 years, whereas at the same time, in Russia, we see a very significant decrease in arms exports. A decrease which is primarily explained by the fact that its major client, India, is now looking for weapons elsewhere, both in India itself, but also, for example, in the US, France, Israel, and a number of other European states. France has, you could almost say, a comeback as the third largest arms exporter in the world, a very significant increase, mainly due to a relatively small number of really big contracts with India, Egypt, and Qatar. Germany remains among the top 5 arms exporters too, and has seen a significant increase. The demand for, in particular, its naval systems, ships, submarines, and also its armored vehicles remains very high in many parts of the world. China, we see a slightly different development here, and just to roll back a few decades, when in the 1990s, China had basically fallen away as a major supplier of major arms, but then it returned in the period 2000-2015, seeing a very significant increase, and it returned back into the top 5 arms exporters in the world, though still over the past 5 years, maybe a bit surprising, that increase stagnated and even we even see a slight decrease. And then finally, I just mentioned the one major newcomer in the top 10 arms exporters in the world, which is South Korea, which, not surprising, considering both the overall development of its industry and also the very large demand for arms in the country itself, has developed a military technical capability that now can produce weapons, though still with know-how and components from others, that actually compete on the international arms market, even in direct competition with companies in the recipient countries themselves, for example, in Europe. So that's really a newcomer in this list. Now, what happened then on the other side, on the recipient side, and here we see a bit the regional changes and trends and patterns. So we see that if we take the lower bar, and compare that to the higher bar, which is the most recent years, we see a bit of a shift there, whereas Asia and Oceania have become slightly less important as arms importers, but still are the largest recipient region in the world. We see a very clear increase in arms imports by the Middle East. And the rest speaks for itself, I think. So we do see some changes there, not necessarily that dramatic overall, though maybe you can mention the case of the Americas, where we see a very significant decrease. That's the region which by now, surprisingly enough in a way, is the one where we see the least arms imports. We then quickly look at the global share of the major arms imports by the 10 largest recipients. There we have Saudi Arabia, which really has now become the largest recipient of arms in the world. It has taken over there from India, And the reason for that is partly because Saudi Arabia itself has increased its arms imports, but it is also because India has decreased its arms imports. That's not because there is no demand. It has more to do by India's choices to invest or to try to invest in procuring arms from its own industry, which hasn't really succeeded. And at the same time, has not really been able to fill that gap which came about because its own arms industry cannot deliver in time by importing arms completely. And also at the same time, as I said before, it has tried to diversify away from its main supplier, Russia, and is increasingly looking for weapons elsewhere. And that may also explain a bit of a gap in its total arms imports in those years, something which we expect to change in the coming years again, where as there are some really major arms deals where deliveries will take place this year and going forward. We have Egypt there, which has appeared as the third largest arms importer in the world, Australia, China, and a number of others. It's important to also stress that most of the countries in this list are either in Asia or in the Middle East, as we already saw before, but this kind of stresses that once again. So that provides you with a bit of a general overview of how international arms transfers have evolved over the past decade. And I hope that on the basis of these kind of these general trends and patterns, there will be some questions and observations which can lead to further conversations and ideas about how to use this data and what kind of conclusions we can draw for particular regions, suppliers, or recipients.
Thanks, Peter. I'm struck by the fact that, again, we're seeing this increase in global arms transfers. I know, as Nana mentioned, there's this inertia, right? Some deals were in the pipeline prior to the pandemic. And so it may take a while to see the true impact of the pandemic on global arms sales. But I'm wondering if you've already noticed any significant effects of the pandemic on international arms trade.
Actually, not really, you could say. Or well, we have seen, of course, but maybe less than you would expect. So if we go back to the first slide I showed, where you could really see that 2020 was a very low year when it came to international arms transfers. Now, part of that, we believe, is explained by the immediate effect on both production and delivery of major arms. So some companies, or many, found that either their workers had to stay home, they didn't have access to the components, they couldn't simply produce what they had planned to produce at the beginning of the year. And then secondly, also they couldn't deliver it. Restrictions on international travel led to, for example, recipients not being able to send their staff to the supplier country to inspect the weapons that were ready for delivery or to train on them. And on the other way around, the companies could not send their staff to actually deliver the systems and make sure that recipients could start to use them. So these things will have played a role. But on the other hand, we have also seen that some companies have made very clear that at the beginning of the year, for example, the French company Dassault, which produces combat aircraft, said they originally wanted to export 13 of them. Then they said around April, we can't export that many this year. But by the summer, they had already gone back to their original plan. And by the end of the year, they had delivered what they had planned to export before the pandemic really spread. So whereas, for example, a company like Lockheed Martin announced in the beginning of 2020 they would deliver about 140 F-35 to both the US and foreign suppliers, but then in the end they only supplied about 120. Still, that was more than in the year before. So it's very difficult to understand what exactly the impact has been, because at the same time, there are, of course, a whole range of other developments that have an impact on international arms transfers. I mentioned, for example, already the case of India, where the dip in arms imports is related to internal procurement processes which are very slow, which are very inert. We can mention, for example, the fact that in the case of the US, one reason why arms imports were a bit lower than originally planned in 2019 was that the whole F-35 deal with Turkey fell through. So those F-35s, which were planned to be delivered in 2020, that never happened for very different reasons than the pandemic itself. And for example, we also see that if we look at the actual figures, we see that a country like the US exported more arms in 2020 than it did in at least 3 other years in the 8 years before. France exported more arms in 2020 than it did in 5 other years in the 9 years before. So these figures are very difficult to assess, and there are many more reasons why there is a, let's say, a dip in total arms transfers for 2020. And there's another thing we can also observe, and that's to do with the longer term trends. That's related to the fact that we also see in 2020 that despite the pandemic, several countries have made very significant decisions about arms import acquisitions in the coming years. Japan, for example, decided to order 105 F-35s. The UAE decided to buy 50 of them, something which I'm sure we'll talk about more later. And there's a whole range of other examples where even states which are already before the pandemic in economic difficulties, such as Egypt, which continue to order major deals, major numbers of advanced arms from a variety of suppliers. So I think the jury is still out there to see whether or not, as it is with military spending too, whether or not we will see a major impact of the pandemic over the coming years. But right now, it doesn't necessarily look like that.
And finally, as a sort of transition to Lauren, I want to ask, it's been 10 years since the Arab Spring. We've seen conflicts throughout the Middle East. We're seeing them this weekend flare up dramatically. There is lots of discussion in parliaments and Congress around the world about the risks of the arms trade with Middle East countries. We're talking about perpetuating conflicts, human rights abuses, the use of force in violation of international law. But yet, when you look at your slides, the Middle East still is, and Saudi Arabia in particular, is still a massive recipient. So I'm wondering if you're seeing any impact of the debate that parliaments are having or governments themselves are having in terms of significant change in arms export to the region, either in terms of volume, or maybe there's a shift in the pool of suppliers, or is it business as usual?
I think it's a very mixed picture there. It's a bit of a surprising one in a way. As you say, there has been an enormous amount of discussion in civil society, in parliaments, in Europe and in the US specifically about arms exports to Saudi Arabia, taking into account the way Saudi Arabia is waging war in Yemen, the objectives of that war, and of course also the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia itself, not in the least, of course, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And all of that has led to a lot of discussion. And in some states, we see that significant arms export restraints have been put in place. Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands are just a few to mention in Europe. And then the most important one is Germany, which of course is as a major global arms supplier, that is a significant thing that they have decided not to continue with any further direct sales of major arms or other arms to Saudi Arabia. But the other major suppliers, whether it's the US, France, UK, Italy, have not really put in place such restraints. Yes, the UK, for example, has had a suspension on its on new licenses for new arms exports to Saudi Arabia from 2019 to 2020. The UK government didn't want that, but it was forced to do so for very procedural reasons by a UK court. And that may have had an effect on the UK chances to continue to be the second largest arms exporter to Saudi Arabia. It was a very big deal in the making for new combat aircraft, and the expectation was that should be signed in 2019, maybe 2020, and then it didn't happen, and that happened, of course, during the time of that particular suspension. So it may be that Saudi Arabia, in that case, has chosen to say, well, we don't really want to rely on the UK based on these events. We just don't think they're a reliable partner. But of course, we don't know for sure if that was the reason for Saudi Arabia not to continue with this deal. It may as well have had to do with the fact that Saudi Arabia sees its oil income for falling, partly related to the pandemic, and that might be a reason there. But the important thing is that the US, France, and several European states continue to supply weapons to Saudi Arabia, to UAE. The only place where we really see kind of a change in the shift in the suppliers, I think is Egypt. And also there, the question is that because of restraints on the side of the suppliers? And the US has put some restraints on arms exports to Egypt, in particular around 2013, 2014. These restraints have been lifted, but at that time then Egypt chose to turn to a number of other suppliers. That may have been done for political reasons, but it might also have been done simply because they could get weapons for a better price there, for example, in Russia, which generally will sell weapons of relatively high quality for much lower prices. So there's a shift there, but even there, it's not dramatic in the sense that there's not countries falling away completely. Even more, certain European states, in particular France, Italy, and Germany, are now playing a very important part in supplying arms to Egypt. So the shifts are not very clear and obvious, despite the Arab Spring, despite all the discussions related to how to restrain arms exports to the Middle East. It's not an obvious change, not in volume, and also we don't see that the other arguably less restrictive arms exporters in the world, such as Russia and China, have really gotten a foothold in the largest markets, except then, of course, Egypt.
Thanks, Peter. It's always a good reminder to mention the Arms Trade Treaty, and those states that you mentioned as being the primary suppliers to that region are all states parties to the Arms Trade Treaty and do have obligations in terms of preventing violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as civilian harm. So good reminder for countries to meet their obligations. I want to turn to Lauren now, because I think it's impossible to talk about trends in the arms trade without looking at the United States and not only what has happened, but what is likely to come. And 2020 was really an unprecedented year for the United States in terms of shifts in arms trade policy, as well as sort of a short-term economic transactional approach to arms sales, unlike any we have seen before. And so I'm wondering, Lauren, if you could talk to us a little bit about what the Security Assistance Monitor's recent report has demonstrated, but also the trends that you are anticipating will continue, and maybe where we'll see some opportunities for change.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel, and our colleagues over at SIPRI. Really appreciated this discussion. So we are the Security Assistance Monitor, which is a program within the Center for International Policy. And we also have looked at arms sales trends within the United States. And to kind of give you an idea of what exactly it is that we're measuring, the Security Assistance Monitor, or SAM, has 3 databases. We look at foreign military training, which is not what this report is about. We also look at security assistance, right, which is more the foreign assistance side of things from the United States, and that will look at a lot of countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Egypt. That's also not exactly what we're talking about. So this report is looking at arms sales trends, and the countries that you'll see, featured here more are going to be countries that have the financial means to purchase arms, and so that's what we're kind of tracking and looking at here. So let me go ahead and share my screen and show you a little bit of our key findings here. One moment. Okay, is everybody able to see the slides here for the arms sales? Okay, so what we have found here is foreign military, in terms of foreign military sales, you see a pretty steady state in the early years. Foreign military sales averaged about...
The slides are missing now. It's your notes.
Okay, go ahead and, all right, one moment. Sorry there.
No, that's okay. Just could only see your notes then, not the slides.
Absolutely. Let me see if this works better. All right, can you see the slides all right now?
It's presenter view, so you might want to have just
yeah, let me. Okay. Well, let me talk through it a little bit.
I can get them up for you.
Yeah, perfect. I appreciate that. Sorry there. But our major finding here was that 2020 was a very big year, particularly compared to previous years. Under the first 3 years of the Trump administration, we had about 63 billion per year in foreign military sales. Under the Obama administration, similar numbers at 62 billion. And so the last year of the Trump administration was a really big departure from previous years. And to understand a little bit about what was kind of driving that, or why that might be, it's important to talk about how arms sales have traditionally worked in the United States. So typically, thank you for adding that. So you can see that green bar at the bottom is really that leap that we saw in 2020. So typically in the US, the United States approves certain arms sales for strategic foreign policy interests. Arms sales are typically meant to support regional stability, strengthening key allies. And it's important to look at how the Trump administration, particularly in its last year, really took a different approach to that by prioritizing what they called economic interests or jobs for Americans producing weapons, which were really more of industry interests. And so, you can see that shift in thinking, and part of that was, what was behind some of those 2020 numbers. So that is, that's a bit what was driving it. And we can go to the next slide if you have that. So here we have some of the top recipients of US arms offers. You can see some of the countries that received really big numbers, particularly the UAE here. That was a case that received a lot of attention as the Trump administration approved F-35s to the UAE as the UAE was establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, and it included aircraft, armed drones, bombs and missiles. And then there are a number of other countries that you will see here featured in this list. Because the overall numbers increased so much, you also saw a lot of increases, really within multiple regions. So this year, the Middle East and North Africa region was a top region for US arms offers, as others have discussed. East Asia and Pacific also represented more than a third of the arms offers, and you'll see some of those countries here as well. Europe and Eurasia represented over a fourth. Other regions were less well represented here. And it's also important to kind of look at what it is that we're measuring here. So we're looking at notifications or offers, meaning the United States is offering to sell arms to certain countries. In most cases, it has not been completed. The transfer happens later. And so, what you see here in these numbers, as Rachel and others have mentioned, the impact is actually felt later. Okay, so if we go to slide 3, you can see the types of arms that are being sold. And, with military aircraft and engines as a top number, and again, something else that's driving some of those high numbers. Our report also goes into issues of transparency. We urgently need more transparency in the reporting of arms sales, and it's not something that gets a lot of attention, but is something that's really important to us and others who use our work. We found that transparency in reporting really did decline under the Trump administration. Particularly, it declined in regard to direct commercial sales, and reporting to Congress on firearms offers of $1 million or more. So those are some areas that we're really continuing to watch, and we would have liked to have more information in our reports on if that information had been more transparent. And then finally, this brings us over to our, some of the recommendations from our report, which of course include increasing transparency. But you will see in the report we have, we would like to see an expansion of the current administration's review of pending arms transfers, the development and release of a new conventional arms sales policy that prioritizes human rights, recommitting to the Global Arms Trade Treaty, applying the Leahy Law in a broader sense to arms transfers, and a number of other ways that would really further regulate foreign military sales and to help Congress do its job of oversight of these sales. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just going to stop the presentation. Lauren, it's really quite remarkable when you see that green line at the bottom of your first slide, the dramatic jump. And Peter mentioned that 96 states have been the beneficiary of U.S. arms in the last 5 years. I mean, that's quite incredible in terms of we're running out of potential markets really for U.S. arms sales. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what is behind such that this unprecedented surge, like what is happening that led to those figures?
Definitely. So part of it is, of course, as a few folks have mentioned, that these packages include offers of F-35s to countries like Finland and Switzerland and Japan and the UAE and Singapore, and these are all very expensive arms. Part of it is that this is the culmination of a line of thinking that really defined President Trump's views on arms sales. So arms sales not as a foreign policy decision, but as an industry tool and as a jobs creator, although we saw from our data that those jobs numbers were really not as high as they were claimed to be. So that kind of shift in thinking really did help to drive a lot of this. Part of it also was the UAE package that was our number one here on that list. And then finally, on a deeper level, great power competition is a paradigm that we are increasingly talking about and seeing in foreign policy discussions. And, as our colleagues at SIPRI have noticed, this is something that is happening around the world as the United States and other countries, particularly larger countries, struggle to keep up with each other, and this drives this competition and is something that we're also watching very closely at SAM.
And I just want to point out that you were just talking about foreign military sales, which obviously by dollar value are the largest, but that does not include, you weren't including direct commercial sales. Those are negotiated by the companies themselves with the recipients. But that leads me to my next question, which is the larger dollar value doesn't necessarily reflect those sales that are of greatest concern. You mentioned the F-35. There may be political and economic considerations with the F-35, but perhaps those are less, very expensive, but perhaps less concerning than maybe a sale of Hellfire missiles to, I don't know, I'm just going to say, Saudi Arabia, which dollar value wise are worth far less, but have a potentially destructive capability. So I'm wondering if you can speak to this a little bit, because dollar values don't always tell the whole story, and particularly not necessarily the story of what is being debated in the United States right now.
Exactly. That's such an important point. And, we do look at the trends in terms of dollar value, but there are a lot of people, ourselves included, also looking at risk as a way to measure, what we should be focused on when it comes to arms sales. And F-35s are a high dollar value, but obviously, an F-35 to a country that does not have a record of serious human rights abuses is not going to be as concerning to us as is, the arms to Saudi Arabia, who has been engaged in very serious bombings in Yemen. The other thing that we keep in mind is that, something like an F-35 is less likely to go missing. So we, when we look at things like direct commercial sales, which includes, small arms, those are the kinds of weapons also that may not have a high dollar value, but are very concerning because they often do, end up in non-state hands and are not easily traced. And that's really one of the reasons why we're so concerned about the lack of transparency, is because no one is really watching what happens to some of these smaller arms.
Thanks. And then just last question, Lauren, before I go to our full Q&A, which I love to see. Do you think that the Biden administration will take a different approach than the Trump administration with regards to arms sales?
Yeah, I hope so. I think you put it in your, in your remarks well when you said the jury is still out. The rhetoric has certainly been better. In the Biden administration announced early on that they were going to pause and review arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and yet we saw that, package to the UAE they indicated would go forward. There has been some, more positive discussion of centering human rights, and yet at the same time we have seen that, arms sales to Egypt directly after, a raid of the family of a human rights activist went forward. So I think we're seeing, some indications that they would like to make a shift, which is something different from the previous administration. Yet we're also seeing this really powerful inertia of continuing kind of business as usual. I think they will be ultimately probably responsive to public pressure in a way that, the previous administration was not. But, we will really have to see how much that rhetoric aligns with reality.
Great. Thanks to all of you. I think this has really been a fascinating discussion, and I do have more questions on my list, but I want to get to our audience questions because I think some of them range from the very technical to the very broad. So I'm going to start with a quick technical question for Peter, which is the TIV, for example, a state-of-the-art armored fighting vehicle in 2020, the same as for an SOTA AFV from 1980, or has it gone up to reflect the increase of quality of the vehicle?
Yes, thanks for that one. It's a good question to kind of once more illustrate that, of course, what we are working here with is statistics, and statistics always have their limitations. And so when it comes to the SIPRI trend indicator value on arms transfers, we have to take into account that what we try to do here is to provide a value to every system. And yes, it will take into account the age of the technology involved. But in the end, it's a very crude instrument where, yes, an item that has been designed in 1980 will have a lower value than that similar type of item designed in 2020. The one in 2020 will have a lot of new things, just like a car of 1980 is not really comparable to a car of 2020. And we try to work with that. We give values to that. But again, what we show here is, of course, not 100% accurate. It gives that indication. It provides an idea of what the overall trends are. And I think that is extremely important to keep into account. Nothing is exactly precise here. It helps us to understand how these trends have developed over time. And I think especially when we see these kind of larger patterns, larger trends, our figures give sufficient precision to say something useful. But then again, as Lauren already pointed out, you also have to look at things where, well, the value is very low. Yes, it may be that, let's say, arms exports to Switzerland will be very high in the coming years because they actually will go further with the acquisition of advanced combat aircraft, whether they come from the US or whether they come from France or from Sweden or elsewhere. But that's maybe not what we're really concerned about. One of the things which I haven't really discussed in the figures which CIPRI shows is the fact that Africa hardly figures in them. You hardly see arms exports to sub-Saharan Africa in comparison to what goes to the rest of the world. But of course, the supply of just a small amount of major arms or a larger amount of, let's say, small arms to, let's say, Nigeria may have a very significant impact on the conflict there. So these figures are really no more than a starting point for the discussion, a matter of raising awareness. And from there, we move on into each and every specific case and have to ask questions about how this may lead to risks to security, to human rights, to international humanitarian law, to peace.
Thanks, Peter. I have another question for CIPRI. Lauren sort of mentioned illicit sales in her remarks, but the question is, to what extent does CIPRI look into illegal arms transfers in illicit arms or military spending in comparison to legal arm deals? Because obviously we're looking, and you all are looking at formalized transactions, but if you take sort of the black and gray market sales into account, we have different figures. So how could does CIPRI look at this, and how could that be looked at in the future?
Let me start from my perspective, looking at the arms transfers, but I think that Nan can maybe also add a bit related to issues like corruption and the difficulty of trying to understand what you could call the illegal military spending, if you wish. It depends very much on what you call illegal. That's the first step to take here. Are US supplies to Syrian rebels, are they legal? I'm pretty sure that President Assad would say no. You may agree or not with him, but still, he kind of has a point there, I'm afraid. So, and you can raise these questions in many other cases too, where we see that a government openly and deliberately supplies weapons to, let's say, a rebel force, we will take them into account. We won't show it as a delivery from that state to that country, but we show it as a delivery from that state to the rebel force. Or, for example, also when the deliveries are not transparent, when the supplier country is not openly doing this, such as, for example, in the case of the UAE to rebels in Libya, we will try to track that too. But obviously the information is scarce. We only kind of scratch the surface there. We only show that there are certain relations, and we only will use that information if it comes from very reliable sources. And so if, for example, there are claims that Russia supplies weapons to rebel forces in Libya, we want to have a confirmation about that from an extremely reliable source. For example, from one of the United Nations panels that specifically monitor the violations of United Nations arms embargoes, and, for example, have tried to understand these observed flows of weapons going through Syria to Libya, and trying to understand to whom it goes, who controls those arms, where are they, and we try to deal with that. But as I say, we only scratch the surface there. So don't count on that kind of, let's call them illicit or illegal or secretive transfers to be covered in any great detail. But I think maybe Nan, it would be so useful if you can say a little bit about that aspect of corruption and how that made your life hard when you try to measure military spending.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, I'll just touch on briefly that, of course, in our data, military spending, we often try to collect as much as possible open source official government budgets. That's where our data comes from. And so, the problem, of course, is that we identified cases where there are what we term, let's say, off-budget military spending. So expenditure that is found to be outside the official government budget. And it is there that often there are cases where mostly funding essentially weapons procurement. In many cases, we've seen this with Mozambique being one example, or Nigeria being another, where it really much, because this is outside the official documents and often maybe even, I think Peter mentioned hidden or secretive, it is difficult for us to track exactly how much money is being spent, what types of weapons are being procured, and who is even receiving the money, or who is receiving often these systems. I think one well-known case recently is the case of Myanmar, how the UN even had a report stating that a large amount of dollar value is in terms of resources being channeled to its military. And even for us, it's very difficult to track down the source of this of the monetary value. So this again makes even the military spending data often sometimes difficult, because we don't have the disaggregation to see some of these in-depth specific line items on procurement. But of course, we're always wary that there are cases where some information can be hidden. And like Peter said, we really try to dig into these things, but of course it's scratching the surface and often trying to find, looking into the unknown. So.
Lauren, did you have anything you wanted to add? I know that question was targeted at SIPRI, but you
Sure.
deal with databases.
I would just add that, corruption is something that we have also really looked at the Security Assistance Monitor. We had a report come out a few years ago about the way that corruption impacts, security cooperation and assistance from the US side, and particularly, looking at countries like Afghanistan, where these kinds of things have, this is less about arms sales, but security cooperation writ large has really kind of distorted aims, and is something that we're, looking for more attention to.
Thanks. We have a question that I think is really relevant, because we've been focused very much on sort of the expected or traditional major arms exporters from the US and Western Europe. So the question is, can panelists talk more about South-to-South weapons transfers? Has there been an increase in countries from Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, exporting systems and platforms to neighboring countries or other global South states?
That sounds to be a question which I might be able to say a few words about. South to South, there are, as I showed in the original slides in the beginning, there are a few countries that are in the top 10 that are in what we could call the global South. China, you could argue, is one of them. I'm not sure to which extent you want to count that as South to South. Of course, it is now playing a very important role there. Israel is another case. I don't know if you want to count that one in the South either, but Israel is a country that has shown that also a smaller country in the South can develop its arms industry, as long as there is a very significant demand in the country itself that can help to helps to fund the building up of an arms industry that can create the kind of arms that can compete on the international market. So Israel has really grown into that. It has especially invested in certain niche products, for example, guided missiles, air defense systems, advanced sensors, eavesdropping equipment, and of course also both, primarily then reconnaissance drones and other advanced reconnaissance equipment. And it's really selling that throughout the world, to Europe, to the US, but definitely you will also see it in the Philippines, you will see it in Nigeria, you will see it in Brazil. So it's really a country that definitely is involved in that, you could say, South to South arms trade. South Korea is the other example. Again, you can question, is that really South? Do we count there? It used to be in the past, but now it has developed into a very different type of country. But also there we can see, as long as there's a very strong internal demand, an arms industry can be built up. But if we take a very classic other example of a country in the south, which certainly is in the south, which is South Africa. There we see quite a different development. In the 1970s and 1980s, South Africa built up its own arms industry, became significant. It became a clear supplier or potential a producer of arms. And then in the 1990s, after the apartheid regime, it also kind of reached out to the rest of, for example, Africa and said, look, we have all this stuff and we are African, so why don't you buy it from us? It didn't really work like that. And right now, the South African arms industry is in complete, well, you could almost say meltdown. My understanding is that where the South African arms industry still is relatively successful is in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE. And interestingly enough, that's most likely going to change too, because there is a brain drain going on where the South African military production expertise is moving in person to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, where then they help to set up a new arms industry, which may become a significant player too. But again, will that be South-South, or will that be primarily within the Middle East itself, or will those industries primarily cater for the countries where they are based? That still has to be seen.
Lauren or Nan, do you want to elaborate on that one, or okay, I'll move on to the next. We talked a little bit about the beginning, about the inertia of military spending, and so far it's been military spending has been independent from the pandemic because things were already in place. But do we think we might observe a significant decrease in military spending as a result of the pandemic in following years? Similarly, Lauren, I'll ask you if we would expect to see fewer arms sales in the future just because fewer things were negotiated during the pandemic than in the past.
Yeah, so I mean, from military spending's perspective, I mean, we've already had essentially announcements by high people in very high positions, such as I think Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the EU Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, which he stated that cautioning the decrease in military spending as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think for many countries, at least within the EU, they're looking into lessons learned from 2009, the financial crisis, where they implemented austerity measures following that crisis, and it saw that military spending really decreased, and it was only in 2019, 2020 where it reached the 2009 pre-2009 levels. And so I think many people from within this defense establishments are very worried about the possible repeat, and of course pushing for this idea that one should not decrease military spending, that also it could create, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it creates additional other possible threats. But of course, on the other hand, we have a lot of these advocacy groups which say that, the question is, should resources in a case where the world is under severe economic recession, should these resources be allocated to the military, and is the military the best way where countries can essentially be brought out of this recession? And if we looked at the recent announcements by some of the biggest spenders for the 2021 budget, we see that the US, China, I think even they've all announced that they will continue to increase its military spending in 2021. Germany, I think even maybe even the UK, they've all announced that they will continue to increase. And so this, again, because these are the biggest spenders, it really sets the tone and the trend for the coming years that unless something dramatically changes, Cypri, we don't really do predictions, but the budget's already out for 2021 for many countries, and at least in the next years, at least next year, maybe things won't change. But again, there might be a lag effect, and something might be reflected in 2022, where given that maybe there's a lag of the financial constraints that certain countries have, this might change. Of course, we've seen this just briefly in some of the oil exporters, where because of the decrease in demand, Many of these oil exporters, such as Oman, Saudi Arabia, I think they've really seen a severe impact on their ability to afford military spending, and so they've essentially gone for cuts to all government spending, and military is one of the cases where it's been cut the most.
Lauren.
Sure. Again, while we don't make predictions, we do look at some of the underlying factors. And, that doesn't suggest to me that we would see a huge decrease in sales. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see more of a return to normal just because 2020 was such an odd year for the United States. But our record of both defense spending and military sales are pretty strong. There hasn't been the public discussion in the United States of shifting or decreasing because of COVID or other factors. Defense tends to have its own set of factors in the U.S. that are weighed differently. So for all those reasons, I would say that kind of a return to a more normal steady state is something that we maybe would likely to see.
Thanks. There's one of my favorite questions is asked here. I think it's sort of my hobby horse, which is the false argument that if the US reduces sales, then other countries are going to fill the void. And all of you have talked about how the US is unchallenged in its dominance of arms transfers, of military spending. And so I wonder if you could each from your perspectives sort of take that question, and it's not going to be for the last time because it comes up all the time, but try and take that one on a little bit about why that mythology is not true. Maybe Lauren, I'll start with you since you're nodding.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's one we see always come up, and it's very popular in foreign policy circles to say, if we don't sell arms to X country, they are going to start buying, Russian weapons, or they're going to start looking elsewhere. I think the first thing I would say is that it's very difficult to do so. Once you have, weapons from a particular country like the United States, those have pretty intensive maintenance plans. They require a lot of training to use. It takes a lot of work to get up on a system and to use it consistently. And therefore, to pivot to a new system is expensive and time consuming, and is not something that countries really tend to do very lightly because of all that's involved. There's not a lot of reporting on this issue. We've looked in the past, I think, because it's difficult to prove a negative, and because, it just hasn't happened as often as people claim that it might, but is a question we hear a lot, and it's good to talk about.
Nan or Peter, do you have anything to add to that one?
I take the first shot here. So I think historically you can of course find examples where states have made that choice or have been forced to make that choice. Iran being a very obvious one. Yes, the US said, no, we're not going to supply any weapons anymore in 1979 after Iran had been its main arms importing customer for about a decade at that time. And yes, it turned out to be very hard for Iran to then maintain armed forces that, at least on paper, in technical terms, in weapons terms, could continue the kind of very high level of hypothetical, at least, military capacity that had been maintained under the Shah. And in another case, Egypt turned actually the other way around. It turned from the USSR to the US, but of course the only reason it could do so was that it then got many of the arms which it received from the US for free as military aid. And I think that's something which specifically in the case of the US has to be stressed, that if the US would stop supplying arms as military aid, of course that would have a major impact. You could already see how that works in, let's say, Pakistan. Certainly, yes, it can turn to China and it can acquire arms there too, but it's just going to cost them a lot more to do it themselves. So I think there's so many of these aspects, and as you already mentioned, Lauren, that the whole fact that you can't just rebuild your armed forces from one particular supplier to another, in particular not if they both use very different kind of basic systems, communication systems, doctrines and all that. And so in particular, if it's not just the US, but also European states, which altogether have a stronger, more restrictive policy, then it probably will have an effect. And yes, in the longer term, of course, someone else will try to take over. That's for sure going to happen in one way or the other, but it's going to cost them. So you have a significant leverage if you use your arms sales to influence states and their behavior.
I want to ask all of you if transparency has been impacted by the pandemic. We've seen arms trade treaty reporting go down dramatically. UN Register of Conventional Arms reporting is going down every year. So I'm wondering if with so many offices that provide the data slower to report or unable to report because of closed computer systems and working from home, et cetera, all of the challenges we've seen to multilateral regimes, are we seeing that trend of transparency also, or decreasing transparency, also impacting the work that you all are doing?
Maybe I'll start. Or Peter, you want to start?
No, you.
I mean, military spending, of course, we look at official government documents, and in that way, at least from our side, the transparency has actually surprisingly improved. We have actually almost all the data points for 2020 are from official government sources, and in many cases, this can be backed up by other independent, let's say, whether it's news articles or other reports that have quoted these figures. I mean, of course, there are cases where countries specifically mentioned that military spending is something of a national, I think, issue of a national security in the case of, let's say, Vietnam. But we really have not seen any decrease in the level of transparency. What we might worry about is that 2020, in the case of military spending, might in some countries be what I call is a lost year, in that for some countries, they only provide a budget document. Whereas, of course, we would like to see countries provide revised documents or actual spending for that year. But because they only provide a budget that was, let's say, passed in late 2019, we will never really know the true effect that COVID-19 has had on a country's military spending, because we just don't know whether that country has changed its budget priorities. And of course, this just won't be reflected. But again, this is, we'll see what happens in the coming years about transparency.
Yeah, let me pick up there, but I think what Nana already explained it on the national level, transparency in military spending has only improved over the years. And the remarkable thing then is to see that on the international level, the reporting of military spending, and for that matter, arms transfers and arms holdings and arms production to the United Nations and also to the OSCE instruments that exist there, that has declined. Now, pandemic may have had some effect, but actually you would almost expect that the civil servants that would have to create these reports and have to submit them would have more time now to do so. They haven't been necessarily going to international meetings. And don't forget, the information we talk about here is not necessarily so secret. They literally could take the reports that Nan has mentioned, the national reports on military spending, and send them to the UN. It's actually a project which we will try to work on during this year to kind of encourage that particular procedure. But and when it comes to arms transfers, it's the same thing. In 2020, the most remarkable development in arms transfers transparency was actually that the United States, for the first time since the operation of the United Nations Register on Conventional Arms started in 1991, I think, for the first time, the US did not submit a report. That has not to do with the pandemic. That probably has to do more with the Trump administration. Admittedly, for that matter, I think also China did not report in 2020 over 2019. So I think that the relation between the pandemic and that type of international reporting, I'm not necessarily so sure if I immediately see it. It could have an effect, but I would also expect that it might have the kind of counter effect. Again, creating more time to do so because you don't have these other things to do. You would hope at least that that has an effect. But no, the reality is that transparency on the international level has only declined steadily over the past 10 years or so.
Lauren, do you want to add?
Sure. I would just note that, we have seen a huge decrease in reporting to Congress on direct commercial sales. And of course, this is something that's less related to the pandemic and more related to choices made under the Trump administration. And that's something that, we really would like to see change. The DSCA is, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency is still, reporting, but what we don't see are details of sales up to the point of transfer. We see that initial notification, and that lack of transparency is problematic because the US Congress does have the ability to stop a sale up to the point of transfer, but if it's not alerted that that transfer is imminent or taking place, then there's a real lack of its ability to do that. And the other thing I would say about transparency is because there were all of this became less transparent under the Trump administration. The Biden administration, by taking its time or not being as active, really kind of perpetuates that, and it's really among many other priorities at the same time incumbent on it to make those changes and be a bit proactive in order to restore that transparency and just get it back to a base level.
Thanks to all of you for that. There are so many questions in our Q&A that I would love to get to. I think I'm going to ask one last one because I do need to end promptly on the hour. So I just want to talk, one thing that had been in the news quite a bit, it was global supply chain and the disruption of global supply chains during particularly the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm wondering if there's any thoughts about how those initial disruptions could affect spending or transfers in the future, or do you think that those have been resolved now? I think it definitely showed some weaknesses in the results of having a multilateral system, but I don't think a multilateral system is necessarily a bad one. So any quick last comments here on global supply chains?
It's a hard one. I think it's not easy to answer, but I mean, let's face it. Some countries can afford to say, okay, we're going to really concentrate on our own industry again, or we have a small group of what we think are really reliable partners, and when we work closer together in Europe and all that. But the reality, I think, is that I would kind of expect business to go on as usual, and that I mean, we see that now already in Europe. We have this whole discussion about having a shared combat aircraft programs, but oddly enough, they managed to still have two separate ones, and that debate is still continuing. So I wonder really to which stage really will be able to kind of go away from that path they were on, where they were making themselves much more dependent on other suppliers simply because they cannot afford to produce all those systems themselves and to develop them. And I don't really see how that reality is going to change much, even though reliability of supply has shown to be precarious in 2020. I think I don't see that change immediately.
Thanks. This has really been a fascinating conversation, and I recognize that there are so many questions that we didn't get to, and have given me many ideas for future events that we should have in terms of what this audience is interested in. And I appreciate we had such a great turnout for the duration of the event that it makes me realize that there really is interest in these topics and a very vibrant discussion to be had. I think I'm going to offer up for all the panelists that people can reach out to them directly if they have additional and follow-up questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, but I am very grateful to our speakers, to SIPRI for their continued partnership in this event, to the Security Assistance Monitor, who we also partner with on a regular basis and really value this subject. The jury is still out on a lot of changes that we expect, not only in the United States, but really from the effects of this global pandemic. And I look forward to having this conversation next year to see, are there additional legacy effects of the pandemic on both military spending and arms transfers. In the meantime, I wish you all continued safety and good health and resilience, and we will pick up this conversation not only next year, but in the interim in all three of our organizations. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see